Okay, good morning all. My name is Lawrence Jackson and I'm the Managing Director of Catalyst Management and co-founder of Philanthrocrat, this user group for fundraising and philanthropy professionals. I'd like to start this morning by acknowledging the original custodians of the land upon which we are meeting today. And as I'm in Sydney, I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And on behalf of the close to 200 people from across Australasia who we have registered for this webinar, I collectively acknowledge the sovereignty and wisdom of all First Nations people Indigenous to Australia and New Zealand. Philanthrocrat was established in 2006 as a result of the encouragement from Peter Phillipson, an esteemed colleague, friend and mentor, who is with us today and will be in conversation with our special guest of honor, Peter Winneke, very, very shortly. So please allow me just to welcome our special guests, thank our event partners, and then I'll hand to Louise to kick off the proceedings. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you onto this call, as well as our special guest panelists, including Louise Walsh, well known to all members of this forum, former CEO of Philanthropy Australia, very good friend, great colleague, and Louise will kindly be providing some framing and introductory remarks. Peter Winneke, our guest of honour, who will be in conversation with Peter Phillipson, the doyen of Philanthrocrats, perhaps our penultimate Australian advocate for giving while living. Peter, we promised we'd make this happen, so here it is, and we've had a great turn-up for it, so kudos to you. Peter Phillipson, who I've already mentioned. So Peter, good to have you back on this call today. And our good friend, Kristen Lark, CEO of the Funding Network, who will kindly provide a vote of thanks, and he's always there to give us good advice and guidance in the background. Again, special thanks to all the organisations who have helped us promote and publicise this morning's events. So just a quick shout out to them in alpha order: the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Studies at QUT, Com Together, the ENFP community at HLB Man Judd, Focus Fundraising, Fundraising Institute of Australia, Fundraising Research and Consulting, Strategic Grants, Thank You, and the Funding Netro. So that is my job done. I can now finish my coffee and I will hand over to Louise to say a few words before she hands over to this real treat we have for you in your virtual breakfast bowls. So over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Lawrence. And it's fantastic to be with everyone this morning. And it does sound like this is going to be a real treat, I have to say, because I hear it's going to be an unscripted session, which is always the best, because sometimes when you do listen to these sort of webinars, everything's scripted. So then the really interesting stuff happens at question time. So, but as you've heard, Peter Phillipson is going to interview Peter Winneke on his book, Give While You Live. And this, I promise you, will be a wide-ranging, stimulating conversation on a topic that I care very, very deeply about, mainly because there's not enough ultra-high net worth Australians doing true strategic giving or philanthropy. A lot of them think they are, but they don't really understand best practice strategic giving and how that works. And on the flip side, unfortunately, a lot of non-for-profits haven't helped the ultra-high net worths to discover the joy of giving, the true joy of giving, because they aren't doing major gift fundraising as they should. A lot of people think they are, but that's another topic. But as Lawrence alluded to, firstly, Peter Phillipson, you know, he's a terrific gentleman who's had a lot of experience on both sides of the fence here. You know, incredible background and involvement with the Jewish Communal Appeal. He has been the founding president of an independent school that started with 14 students and now has 400. So I think that's one of, the things that he's most proudest of with his career. But he's a highly effective and successful volunteer fundraiser amongst a number of other feats. Peter Winneke, who's the author of the book and who you're going to hear most from today, has the most experience of anyone I know in Australia of strategic, impactful giving. He's established more than 100 philanthropic family foundations. More recently, he's been the CEO of one of the biggest family foundations. So he's been in the hot seat actually, giving it out. That will remain anonymous, which is unfortunate, but we know that's the case. But he's also sat on a number of boards of various foundations, including also the likes of Philanthropy Australia. But, he did begin his career on the dark side, in the corporate sector, like I did, specialising in insolvency and mergers and acquisitions. And then he discovered his true joy, the philanthropy sector, and he hasn't looked back. But as I said earlier, he is the true expert on this topic in the country. There's others who will claim they are, but I can tell you now they don't come close to this guy. So sit back, enjoy, and welcome Peter and Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just show you Peter's book. This is a little bit of a plug for Pete. He deserves it. But what I also want to show you is the side view, or if you can see it here. Because this wasn't my book, I couldn't go through it with highlighter. Thank you, Lawrence. I will return it to you. But I just want you to see how many things I put in as worthy of note as I was going through the book. So that in itself should be a measure of how valuable Peter's thinking is. Now,
but you keep that, Lawrence, or buy another one.
Well, we'll leave that to us to sort out. So what I thought we might kick off with today, and as Louise mentioned, this is unscripted, so Peter has not much idea of what's going to come up. We did have a chat for probably, I think it must have been an hour. It didn't feel like it earlier this week, just to get to know each other. And I want to kick it off, Pete, by asking you the question, what's the big difference between philanthropy in Australia and the US, particularly at the top end?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and terrific to have so many people online today for the conversation. Look, there's a bit of history there. The States is a little bit older than us. It's a larger population in the States. There's a bit of a disdain if government wants to get involved with their lives more so than here. And when they moved out from the east to the Wild West and what needed a city hall, they didn't run back to the east and say, look, government, can you come and build us a city hall? They built it themselves. So we're sort of more from the British model, of course, post-colonisation. Historically, we were taxed a bit higher. Historically, a better safety net. So we just haven't built that culture of giving. And there are also some differences in cultures, as you know, Peter. Americans, we're generalising, Americans tend to be better at celebrating success than we are and talking about it, and that includes their giving. We also we have an Order of Australia system, which the Americans don't have. So part of their, not sure social climbing is the right phrase, but part of their social climbing is giving. And if you're financially successful in the States, it's a given that you will share some of that, and you're almost a social pariah if you don't. We don't have that. And Peter, I wish somebody would do some research on the tall poppy syndrome, because it's alive and well here. So we don't mind if people get success, but if they get too successful, we think, we better tear them down now. That links into our giving. We're a cynical bunch, so we haven't built that culture of sharing our wealth.
So, Pete, when we look at things like, BRW rich lists and all the rest of it, and there are lists of big givers, could we link the two? Excuse me. And could we have it that alongside so-and-so's worth $5 billion, in brackets, has given $10 away this year? And what would that do?
Yeah, well, I wish we would. So I don't know why we don't do that Peter. You might know the Sunday Times in the UK has done that for a number of years now. And when it was the BRW rich list a number of years ago, I got a letter in the BRW saying, because some people complain about rich lists, and I said, well, it's just a list. That's okay. I'm okay with that. But why don't we add an extra column? This is about 15 years ago. Percentage of wealth given away. And sometimes with the lack of, I suspect we'll come to the lack of transparency in the philanthropic sector in Australia at some point in the next hour. It wouldn't be easy to do given the lack of transparency, but let's have a crack at it. And I think if you have a crack at it and you get it wrong, the families will be on the phone providing some evidence of actually, no, we don't give 0.1% of our wealth, we give 5%, and here's the evidence. So, and it's all about, we need role models, and you can either, it's the old stick or carrot. Now, I prefer we could inspire people to share more of their wealth, but at the end of the day, I'm up for whatever works.
So, I mean, this leads me to the next element of this, which is some people anonymous, some people want their name on the side of the building or the back of the dunny door or whatever it is. Does it really make a difference?
Yeah, and look, I'm a bit sort of agnostic about that, Peter. If there are times when I see, my goodness, there's so much discussion about the naming rights here as opposed to the impact that the gift will have. And, we often celebrate the gift as opposed to the impact, when an issue is resolved. I think we need to flip that a bit. But if people are going to give more because they get their name on the side of the building, I'm fine with that. As long as it's realistic, as long as it's not it needs to be a significant gift to be able to, depending on the size of, every case is different, depending on what's happening, what the capital campaign is. But people shouldn't be allowed. There've been a number of cases where people have got naming rights forever for a pretty modest gift. So, but it's case by case. If that gets people giving, I'm fine with it.
So would you recommend that when there's sort of the large naming right gifts that you carefully build in some sort of term limit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, there have been cases where somebody's got naming rights for a modest building and a modest gift, and then 30, 40 years later, the building is not up to grade any longer. It's going to be demolished, but the naming rights are there forever. So I did hear recently somebody's got recent naming rights for 30 years. The recipient partner thought the building would probably be around for at least 30 years, so the naming rights were given for 30 years only.
But don't we also run a risk with naming rights? If you look, for example, at the Sacklers in the US, where their name went to mud, or whatever polite way you want to describe it,
yeah.
And then the trauma that caused organisations.
Yeah, well, I think I'm not a naming rights expert, but you'd have something in the contract that says if your name has been besmirched for whatever reason, or it's going to bring our organisation into disrepute, that and with listing some obvious reasons how that could occur, that the rights can be removed.
Looking at some of the situations you've been involved with, I'm assuming that most of the people on this session have at times asked for money. And if you were in a position where you thought you'd done a really great job in this situation and you'd had a number in the back of your mind, and the person that you're talking to comes up with a number significantly less, what do you do?
Well, yeah, sometimes it depends on the context, Peter, but firstly, there's a few ways you could play that, depending on the context of where you are in your campaign and what your needs are, and whether they are going to be a key player in the campaign. You could accept it and think, okay, let's play a longer game here and aim for a larger gift in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Or you could get hold of a colleague of this potential donor and get them, because we're influenced by our peers, get the colleague of the potential donor to sit down with them and explain, well, look, that's terrific what you're doing, but this organisation needs to go from A to B, and the only way it's going to get there is if people like you and I put in a lot more. So if you go higher, I'll match it. So there's a few different ways you can try and have a crack at that, but you've always got to be really conscious that it's a long-term relationship, and you've got to know the person and how hard you can push. And if you don't know them, if you're getting a large gift, you probably know them well, and you've got to work out. You've had to have built that relationship, so you know when you can push and when you can't.
So let's say you're running a major campaign. Let's say the target for it is, say, 10 mil, just to make my arithmetic easy. You've done your rounds and you've hit up your major targets, and you're sitting there at 3 or 4 mil, and you think, good grief, I've run out of people to hit up. I'm only at 3 to 4 mil. I don't know where the next 6 is coming from. What would you do?
Yeah, I think I'd be going back to the champions and saying, look, we've got an issue here where we're well short. And so we're in a difficult position. We're going to need 3 or 4 champions to hopefully help us by putting more on the table, and probably something like a matching gift. So if you can get your champions to each put in another $500,000 or thereabouts, subject up to $500,000, subject to matching, and then in aggregate, if you can get 2 or 3 or 4 of your champions to do that, and then go back out to the public and your database. Thank you for your gift. We're actually going to need more to get this done, because if we get it done, this is what the outcomes are going to be over the next decade.
Do you believe in during a campaign actually sort of letting the public know or not know, or donors know or not know where you are?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Peter, because I'm actually not a fundraising expert. I'm usually on the other side of the fence. I can provide some commentary here, because I've seen various campaigns over the years. But there are probably people better placed than me to answer that. And again, it's probably a case by case. You've got to know your database, and how honest can you be, and or not how honest, but how upfront you can be.
And just changing tack a little bit, I'm always amazed by large corporates who actually give corporate money to causes or champion causes. What's your view?
Yeah, it's a tricky issue, particularly for public companies who have got so many different stakeholders, Peter. And they've got to be careful, because there are a lot of issues out there. So where do you start and where do you stop? Particularly if you're a publicly listed company. I think if it's aligned to the mission of the company in some way, I think that's fine. But some would argue, well, I mean, you've got to build your corporate social license to operate. If it's within your mission or thereabouts, I think it's okay. But it's a complex issue. It's a tricky issue. You've got to be really clear with what your strategy is.
But from a shareholder's point of view, would the shareholder, you think, be happier if they said, look, guys, we're going to give you all the dividends, but we'd like to encourage you to make gifts out of it?
Yeah, no, most shareholders are not going to buy that.
Which is why the company does it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Shareholders don't like to be told what to do, and we know that from the tax office that 70% of taxpayers don't claim a gift for a gift to a charity. Don't claim a deduction for a gift to a charity. So that would suggest that most shareholders are not making a gift to a charity. So,
do you actually think the government does enough to encourage charitable giving?
Peter, I'm not convinced it's the role of government to do that. And I don't think we should need it. Yes, that's a nice to have. The government's probably got other issues to. I think the government's probably got other priorities. I think sometimes we look to government too much. We've got significant wealth in this community that's been built in the last 3 to 4 decades. I don't think, if I was government, I'd be saying, well, why do you need us? You've got significant wealth in the community. Why can't you get together with bodies such as Philanthropy Australia and develop your own giving campaign? I know you're aware, Peter, the Productivity Commission recently did an inquiry on philanthropy, and Philanthropy Australia, the peak body, put in a very comprehensive submission. But in my mind, there are a number of areas in there. It was asking the Productivity Commission on how to grow the sector. That seemed a bit odd to me. I think we know how to grow the sector, and part of that's a giving campaign to encourage families to share more and why. I think we can do that without government.
You mentioned in your book, there's a whole large section on the giving pledge. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know it's one of your pet topics.
Yeah. I think part of the reason, we sort of touched on this at the start of the chat, Peter, part of the reason we don't have a strong giving culture in Australia, particularly amongst high net worth families, is the lack of role models. So a couple of years back, I was trying to implement Australia's giving pledge. In a nutshell, after various testing and feasibility studies with a lot of high net worth families, and I spoke to probably 300 high net worth families on this issue, lots of feasibility study early on. Initially, I had a sort of a sliding scale on what percentage of wealth you would publicly commit to giving away. It was based on your net disposable wealth, your net investable wealth. Sort of thought, no, actually, it's too hard, it's too high, it's too complex. Dumbed it down, Peter. At the end of the day, it was, if you've got net investable wealth of $20 million or above, that you would publicly commit to giving away a minimum of 20% of that in your lifetime or upon your death. So just 20%. You can retain your 80%, and you don't have to do a thing, because you can actually do it by your will upon your death. Obviously, we would then be encouraging people to do it in their lifetime. It's the Chuck Feeney, give while you live. We need the role models. We are influenced by our peers, and we know there are a number of families who are very generous in this country doing great stuff. As you said before, not all of them talk about it for a range of reasons. Tall poppy syndrome, they're private, people don't know who they are. If we can build, and the idea of the pledge, Peter, was to get, if we got 25 plus influential high net worth families in every state and territory publicly committing to giving away a minimum of 20% of their wealth in their lifetime or upon their death, that then builds momentum. We've got 100 families, hopefully many of whom are influential, and people will look at that and say, well, that's amazing. I know a bunch of those families, and I really respect them. And actually, I've got more than them. And we've got 1% of our wealth in our foundation. We can do more. Look, we can't do the 20% now because we're, for a variety of reasons. But we can commit to 5%, and then let's grow that to 10%, and then 20% over time. It's the role modeling that we need here, Peter. I think a really interesting example, which I use in the book, is Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. He passed away a decade ago, and lots of discussion when he passed away. Steve Jobs, he's a freak. He changed the world. We've all got these Apple products. But in the States, they had a major conversation around, but hang on a second, what did Steve Jobs do for our community? And I gather he shared very little of his financial success. So in the States, they then mark him down because, yes, he built an amazing, unique company. He created significant wealth, but he didn't share it with the community. Now, that discussion would never happen in Australia. And I think it's interesting, Sidney Meyer, the founder of the Meyer Emporium, who died in 1934, they say that so he was buried in the Box Hill Cemetery in Melbourne in 1934. They say that 100, and he did a lot for the community in his lifetime, and left 10% of his estate to establish the Sydney Mile Fund. During the Depression, he was employing married men with children to build the boulevard around the Yarra and New South Yarra. He was creating jobs, so he did a lot for the community. And they say that 100,000 people lined the funeral procession. That's 10% of the population of Melbourne. Now, for what business person in Australia would we do that today? I can't.
Well, you might get a sporting personality, but definitely not a business one.
No, yeah, 10% of the population. So we need those role models. So that was to come back to your question. We need to build those role models. And I've been talking to people for 2 decades on how do we change the giving culture, particularly amongst high network families, and it's organisations like Philanthropy Australia and others often focus on structural change. We've had a lot of great structural change in the philanthropic sector in the last 2 decades. We don't need structural change. Yes, it'd be nice to fix the DGR system, and that's probably about the only positive outcome that will come from the Productivity Commission's philanthropy inquiry. But that fixing the DGR system, that is not going to rapidly grow our giving culture. We need to change the culture, and that's through role modelling, and that was the aim of the Giving Pledge.
But what happened to the Giving Pledge that you were so involved in trying to get going here?
Well, in a nutshell, it needed funding for the first 2 to 3 years to build an incredible communication strategy, because build really good 3-minute videos on of families of why they would why they're giving, what they get out of it, and the satisfaction that brings them, and then video stories of actual change that's been created as a result of their giving, and also to pay for a very small secretariat. It needed a tiny team. So that there are various parties who were looking to fund that, and they couldn't collaborate together. That was sort of the sad part about it. It was a simple issue with everyone agreed we need a pledge that's going to help shift the giving culture, and then we couldn't collaborate. So part of the frustration for me was, this is a simple issue. It's inexpensive, and we're struggling in the philanthropic sector to collaborate on it. How are we going to go with really complex $200 million issues? We need to really work on the collaboration in the philanthropic sector, which is not strong. But I think in the next few years, Peter, I think the pledge will fly, because if there are better ideas to dramatically change the giving culture amongst high net worth families, I'm up for them. But I've been asking people for a couple of decades. I'm not hearing them. So I think the pledge will get up in the next couple of years. Someone else can come in and have a crack at it. I'm happy to help them.
Interestingly, Pete, I noticed in your book there's no reference to faith-based giving, and yet for many communities of faith, there's a concept of tithing, all of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, Peter, and you raised that when we had a quick chat the other day, and I made a note. I'm not planning a second edition, but I've made a note that if I do write a second edition, because I think that's an omission. I think it would have been an interesting inclusion. Because when I joined the philanthropic sector in Australia 22 years ago, it was really a bunch of Jewish families and not much else, and that was partly linked to the Jewish tithe of give 10%. There's evidence to suggest that and I don't have a particularly strong faith myself, but there's evidence to suggest that if you've got a strong faith, you tend to be more financially generous than if you don't. So, I've worked with a family in the past with a strong faith, and that was part of the reason they were trying to bring other people to build their faith, because their generosity would possibly be greater. So I think you raise a good point there.
Yeah. All right. So let's just look at a different aspect. a lot of the people on this call, I assume, are working in, their paid job is to do with philanthropy. Do you think people in this sector are paid adequately?
Not 20 years ago, when I halved my pay to join the sector. There's been a shift there, Peter. So no, initially, but there's been a shift, and they should be well remunerated, because if we want to professionalise the sector, and a lot of the practices in the philanthropic sector in Australia, Peter, are unchanged over the last 5 decades, and that's partly for the reason I wrote the book. I mean, I don't have all the answers. Nobody's got all the answers, but I hadn't seen a thorough book on the philanthropic sector in Australia in terms of best practice giving. So I thought I needed to have a crack at it. If we want to bring smart, and I'm really optimistic about the philanthropic sector. I think it's going to grow dramatically in the next couple of decades. And that means we're going to have to professionalise the sector. There's going to be opportunities for lots of young, smart people to come into the sector. We need them to see that it's a really interesting career pathway, and they need to be well remunerated. So it's interesting. A couple of years ago, I saw. Now we know McKinsey doesn't have the answers to the world. We know that. I think sometimes they think they do. But they do employ really smart people. And a couple of years ago, I saw, within the space of 3 months, I saw 3 people from McKinsey, each in their late 20s, leaving McKinsey to join the philanthropic sector. And they were to earn, pretty decent salaries. So you need to, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. So you need to, if you want to get smart people into the sector to professionalise it and to maximise impact of foundations, they need to be well paid.
And if we look at the board of these foundations, should board members be paid or not?
Yeah, that's about 10 years ago, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, they have their magazine, Company Director, whatever it's called. And I was asked to write a piece, should for-purpose organisations, should they pay their directors? And everyone says, oh, of course they shouldn't. Everyone should volunteer. But, if we're trying to tackle and the same with foundations, if we're trying to tackle some of the most wicked problems in our community, why do we expect board members not to be paid? Now, I think it's a case by case. If you've got a for-purpose organisation or a foundation that has a modest balance sheet, perhaps you don't have the capital to pay them. That's fine. But if you've got decent resources, why shouldn't they be paid? They're tackling the biggest issues in the community. If you're going to join the board of a vacuum manufacturer, you get paid. But if you join the board of something which is having a crack at the biggest issues in the community, no, you can't be paid. So again, it's a case by case, depending on the resources of the organisation. But I say, bring it on. Let's have a serious crack at these issues. Let's get the right people on the board. And as I write in the book, Peter, most foundation boards I have seen don't have the skills around the table to tackle their mission. They're usually just a bunch of, not always, there's some really impressive boards, but often it's just friends who are invited to join the board. It's sort of the friends might have a great corporate background, but if your mission's to tackle early childhood development or climate change or First Nations Australians issues, just because someone's had a great career in commerce or law or something, that doesn't, they're probably not qualified to come onto the board.
I noticed in your book you have quite a big shot at licensed charitable trusts. And seeing as we're talking about basically administrative costs of foundations, do you want to expand on your feelings there? And please don't hold back.
Well, gee, I can't believe you noticed that, Peter. We have historically we had a whole stack of licensed trustee companies in Australia. We now really just have 2 large ones. perpetual and equity trustees. Between them, they administer about 2,000 charitable trusts, which in aggregate have assets of north of $6 billion. So they're all charitable trusts set up for us, the community. You know, the beneficiary is us, the community. So they're not breaking any laws. You know, they wouldn't do that. But yeah, they're listed ASX listed companies, and we often, as we wander through life, we see conflicts of interest everywhere. It's how you manage them. It's the important thing. I'm not sure you can manage the conflict of interest between being an ASX listed company and being a trustee of a charitable trust. I mean, we've got the Charitable Alliance was put together a decade ago to have a crack at this issue. Many senior people in the philanthropic and for-purpose sectors are aware of what's going on. There's significant fees are being charged. This is part of the conflict of interest. We've got a number of case studies, numerous case studies where the funds in the charitable trusts are not. They don't go out to tender of, okay, who's best placed to manage them and who's going to charge the best fee. The funds just go into the licensed trustee company pooled fund, so that they don't go out to tender. So, you know, there's your first sort of raised eyebrow. Well, hang on, there's what sort of governance is going on here. Legally, they're probably charging 1% to manage the money, and then legally they can charge 1.058 or whatever it is, 1.05% for what they say the pain and suffering of being the trustee. So there's 2 percentage points. The yield's probably only 5% if grossed up. So 2/5 of the income is often going to the licensed trustee company, and some of these are sole beneficiary trusts. So there's actually very little work to do. You get 2/5 of the income is going to the licensed trustee companies, and of course there's no transparency what's going on here. There are 2,000 charitable trusts. For the vast majority of them, for 90% of them, we know that the trustee company is the sole trustee, so nobody's watching. The other 10%, there are co-trustees, which might be family members. That's where we get the case studies, so we can see the increase in fees that have been charged over the last decade. And the Charitable Alliance, we estimate the fee increases is 50 million each year. So over the last decade, an extra 500 million in fees. So there's a conflict of interest. There's no transparency, and there's almost no portability. If you're a co-trustee and you say we don't like the service being provided, the fees are too high, it's almost impossible to remove them. You have to go to court, and if you lose the case, you've got to pay for the fees yourself if you're a co-trustee, but the licensed trustee company can dip into the assets of the charity to pay their fees. So no one's going to take the risk of losing their house.
So maybe the community, the philanthropic community, should actually set up its own licensed charitable trustee and offer
exactly. That. That's right. But if we were starting again and we had 2,000 charitable trusts, we wouldn't be putting them in a for-profit model. You'd put them in a not-for-profit model. That's what should occur.
Let's come back to families, which you spend a lot of your time with. How do you find you can handle the conversation in a family, talking about estate, talking money after death, involving the kids, family, friction, all of that?
Well, in terms of giving and thinking about a constructive use of wealth, what I learned very early on, Peter, is because I was selling philanthropy, and it's not an easy sell, and you can't do the hard sell. What I learned very early on, and I write about this in the book, is a family foundation can be an extraordinary educational tool for the next generation. So many learnings, so many teachable moments. So you've got whether you set up a sub fund with $50,000 in it, a sub fund within a public ancillary fund, or you set up your own foundation, such as a PAF, a private ancillary fund with $1 or $2 or $5 million, whatever it is, it's got finite resources. So the first thing the kids are learning about are investment strategy. So which hopefully includes discussions around impact investing. So that's terrific. Lots of learnings for the kids. So we've got that sorted. That's good. What's next? Well, what's our vision? What's our mission with the foundation? So what I've run for many years is philanthropic vision workshops with families. You get the kids and the parent. Usually there's a mum and dad and kids. Get them to separately do some pre-work around their individual values, their family values, their aspirations of the foundation, what upsets them about the world, what excites them, bring them together for sort of a half-day workshop. And the aim of that is because you can't tell families what to do, you sort of guide them along the way. The aim is, we sort of touch on best practice giving. So a lot of big foundations do what I call spray and pray. They've got 5 or 6 focus areas and they're just little dollops here and there for funding projects for one. Most philanthropic funding, as most of the listeners will know, is for a project for 1 to 2 years. You can't get much done in 1 to 2 years. So we've got to encourage families to move away from that. Best practice giving is just pick 1 or 2 areas, and we discuss this with families in terms of maximising their impact. Pick 1 or 2 focus areas only, and then work out whether that's climate change or early childhood development, whatever the case may be, and then work out who's doing the best work in that space, and then back them long term with unrestricted funding. Have the conversation up front around, what does success look like? How are you going to measure your impact? What are your KPIs? What are the milestones along the way? So you can see whether the organisation is still on track, and if it's not, well, let's have a frank conversation on why it's not and how it's going to get back on track. So all these learnings for the kids around best practice giving, meeting with incredible executives from for-purpose entities who are having a crack at major issues in our community. That's the thing that I often start with, Peter, to try to get families to think around a more constructive use of their wealth. And feeding into that is issues such as, well, how much is enough, and how much do the kids need? And I've sat down with families. I've actually worked out how much is enough. So, because this is with high net worth families, when they do the calculation of how much is enough, often there's a bit of surprise around. Okay, the surplus is bigger than we thought. So then the letting go becomes a bit easier. We thought we were being generous, but we've got a surplus is higher than we thought. We can give more, and then obviously what feeds into that conversation is that, well, how much the kids need. And I'm sure a number of people on this chat have heard the fantastic Warren Buffett quote on leave enough for your kids to do anything in life, but not enough to do nothing. It's a classic Buffett, wise, concise. We could transform the size of the philanthropic sector overnight if high net worth families stop leaving significant assets and income streams to their children, which is not always. Sometimes I've seen it managed very well. More often, I've seen it not managed well, and we know we get our self-esteem in life from our achievements, and we need to work hard and fail and succeed and go from there.
From my own personal experience, sometimes the largest source of gifts is actually dysfunctional families. Have you had the same?
I have. I've seen it. It's probably not the majority of families that I've seen, but every family is a bit weird, Peter. If we started talking about our own families, I'm sure we could get to some weirdness pretty quickly. But then you put a big pot of cash in the middle, and everything gets emphasised. So it's an issue that fascinates me, and it's interesting that those that inherit wealth tend to share less of it because they feel this obligation that they've inherited, so they need to maintain and preserve for the next generation. I don't agree with it, and I think it's a bit unusual, but it is what it is. Those that are self-made are more likely to share more of it. Really interesting psychology.
You actually talk about, holding on to it. Are you a believer in, if let's say this foundation has 10 mil or 100 mil, whatever the number is, that they should actually be spending it down, or should they say we want it there in perpetuity?
Yeah, and look, there are arguments, Peter, either way for perpetuity or spend down. Look, early on in my philanthropic journey, I was a perpetuity man, and then as I gained more experience, I I landed on we need to talk about. So there's no right and wrong answer, and you don't tell families what to do, but I think the arguments for spend down are so compelling. I see foundations all the time, and their focus area is climate change, and yet if you believe the climate science, we need to act now. Yet they're drip feeding funding to climate change over the next 50 years because they're a perpetual foundation. I mean, it's weird thinking. I've worked with families. I mean, the fourth generation never knows the first. And when I say the first generation, I mean the wealth creators. The fourth generation never knows the first generation. I've seen the passion dissipate in the foundation. So I'm a Chuck Feeney man. You know, his saying was, "Why would you leave the fun of the fund to someone else to give your money when you're gone?" He used to talk about giving while living. Get on with it. So $1 spent today is worth more than $1 spent tomorrow. Get on with it. Future generations will create their own wealth to solve problems that we're not even aware of today.
But, you know, if you have a situation, let's say, where a donor has been funding a certain charity, a significant part of its income for, 10 years, and then suddenly says, well, guys, we're running this down. You've got 3 years to go, and then we're out.
Yeah. Well, that's where you've got to carefully manage it, Peter. It's a really good point. That's part of the spend down strategy. You've got to be really open and honest with your partners, as you should be anyway. And have a proper exit strategy. Right, we are closing the doors in 3 years' time. We've been funding you for a decade. Ordinarily, you would have given them 5 years' notice. You're not getting any more funding in 5 years' time because we won't be around. So we're going to start dialing down our giving from, let's just pick numbers. We're going to dial down from 100,000 to 800, 600. So you're dialing down, but at the same time, hopefully you're as we know, philanthropy is not just about cash. It's about all your resources, including your networks, which tend to be usually pretty strong. So whilst you're exiting, you're bringing in other partners who can fill the gap that you're leaving. You're probably doing that with some match funding to get them excited with the leverage. You're bringing in other partners to take over when you're gone.
Would you actually then suggest to this foundation, let's say they've been giving $100,000 a year to a certain source, and they say, look, the family's had enough of this, and whatever the original reasons are gone, that we turn around and say, okay, we'll give you, if we're giving you $100,000, we're going to give you 1.5 mil, a one-off hit, you sort it out for yourself?
Well, you could do that too. Every case is different. I mean, you'd want to be sitting down with a partner and saying, what's best for you, at the same time make sure you're bringing in other partners. So it's a case by case. That in some cases that would be the best approach. Others maybe not.
I mean, there's been actually a lot of questions coming in, and I'm picking some points out of them as we go. I want to come to one different area altogether, which is more, you've commented on the disappointment that you've had with the giving pledge or the non-rise of the giving pledge. What's been giving you the greatest buzz?
I'm really optimistic about the growth of the sector, Peter. I mean, it's partly weighted money. Families have created so much wealth, and they're really starting to think. I'm seeing a lot of evidence. They're really starting to think through, what are we going to do with this? What's the constructive use of this? I'm not sure that little Johnny and little Mary should get the lot. It's too much now. So I'm seeing more families thinking about a constructive use of their wealth. I've been talking to wealth advisors for a couple of decades, and of course they're gatekeepers. They're either providing legal advice or accounting advice or managing money for high net worth families. Traditionally, most of those advisors not so interested in philanthropy and not so interested in raising the issue. I think they're being pushed by families on, okay, how can you help us with a more holistic view of our wealth? Morgan Stanley at the start of the year appointed, so you know, they're a wealth advisory, appointed a head of philanthropy. And this head of philanthropy's role is often, that sort of role is garbage, really. They're just looking for funds under management from charities. That's not what Morgan Stanley are doing. They've appointed this person to work with the advisors and their clients to set up foundations. Now, I write in my book, I'll be staggered in 5 years' time if every wealth advisor doesn't have some sort of philanthropic advisory person on their books, or at least access to by a consultant, because families are pushing this issue. And I think, just also to answer your question, I see the sector slowly professionalising in terms of best practice giving. Pick a couple of areas, do them well, long-term unrestricted funding. Got a long way to go there, but it's heading in the right direction.
All right, in the just a few minutes we've got left, what's been your greatest disappointment other than the Giving Pledge?
We only have today, we have about 2,000 PAFs, private ancillary funds. You know, we should have at least 10,000. We've got about 2,500, I think it is, sub funds. I mean, you can set up a sub fund for $10,000 or $20,000. We've got about 2,500, 3,000 of those. I mean, we should have 100,000 of them. So it's been really slow to build this culture of giving. We've got to sell it better. As I said earlier, we've got to let families know the educational tool of a family foundation for your children is unbelievable. You've got to have one of these. We've got to sell that better. It's the role modelling. It is coming back to the Giving Pledge. We need more role models to step up and say, look, we're giving, and we're giving material sums. So the material, not just giving, but material giving becomes the norm. And you know, I think we need a lot more leadership in the sector. I think Philanthropy Australia and others can do a lot more in this space. I mean, Philanthropy Australia is, you know, I was at their conference a couple of weeks ago, 1,000 people. They were mainly charities. They need to have conferences for donors. The trustees and directors don't go because they know there's going to be a queue of 100 charities behind them, tapping them on the shoulder. Organisations like Philanthropy Australia need to spend more time on how do we build our giving culture as opposed to working with charities.
I think that's a very valid point, that donors don't want to be in a room they don't want to swim with the sharks.
No. Now, there are times when they should, because that's when you learn. But there's ways to curate sessions. Okay, we're going to have a session over here on climate change. We're going to have a session over here on First Nations Australians and learn best practice, what's happening on the ground. But if you want to grow the sector, you need to get the directors and trustees of foundations in the room. We need to teach them best practice. Tell them what to do, but in a diplomatic way. We need to move away from funding projects for 1 to 2 years. It can be taught. I mean, Philanthropy Australia should be a philanthropy centre of excellence where they're teaching best practice giving and exciting families to go bigger and bolder.
You know, I mean, it's interesting looking at the chat. PAFs keep coming up time and time again in the chat. And yet PAFs have this, being DGR2s, they have this limit on the fact that they cannot give to anything that isn't a DGR1. What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, well, we could probably tweak that. But, I mean, there are 30,000 DGR1s, so there are plenty of opportunities. I think the biggest issue with PAFs is the transparency. I mean, 20 years ago, I was an advocate for PAFs to retain their transparency, but that was for the pragmatic view of, yes, I knew the transparency in the philanthropic sector in Australia wasn't strong enough, but we needed, my view back then, families are telling me we need to retain our privacy, otherwise we won't set up a PAF. So my pragmatic view was, okay, let's build the 10,000 PAFs, then work out what the right transparency levels are. 20 years later, we've still only got 2,000 PAFs. So it's not privacy that's stopping PAFs being created. And, you know, PAFs for 2,000, there's the aggregate assets of $10 billion. Again, they are community assets. We are the beneficiaries. So there should be total transparency. As a lot of the listeners will know, you type the PAF name into the charities, the ACNC, the Charities Commission website, and it doesn't come up if they've ticked the privacy button. they should lose their privacy, and that will improve best practice. I mean, transparency, shining a light. You know, sunshine's the best disinfectant. We can see who they are, what they're doing, what they're funding, and that will improve their practices, because people are going to look at it and say, well, actually, you're not doing much at all. Look how high your costs are. Transparency will improve a lot of that. And some of them, families, just community expectation will say, gee, that family's worth 200 million and they're perhaps $1 million. Community expectation, for a lot of them will think, oh, hang on, we can't have 1 million in our path. People know we're worth 200 million. We're going to have to put in a serious number. And it will happen.
All right. On that note, Pete, I mean, we've been going for almost heading for an hour. So I'd like to hand over to Kristen for her to do some closing remarks. And by the way, this has been a good chat. And I don't think I threw too many at you that you couldn't handle. I don't think I threw any at you couldn't handle.
We could have gone for another hour, Peter.
For sure. I've got still umpteen pieces of paper here with questions.
We'll have to do another one.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to both Peter and Peter for your great insights and for sharing so much with us. As a way to say thanks, I thought I would maybe perhaps give everyone some actions that they could think about as a way to thank you for sharing your time and to pay it forward. So, one, buy Peter's book. Would be an action that everyone could take, and dog ear it and keep it for yourself, and encourage others to buy it as well. Two, consider what you can do right now to help grow the culture of giving in Australia. There are a number of great ideas that we had came through today. Look for opportunities to collaborate for greater impact. Showcase role models of giving at all levels, not just the uber wealthy, but at all levels, and look for opportunities to spread the joy of giving, through impact storytelling about donors and the impact they can have, and really look for opportunities to do that in all our work. So thank you so much for taking the time to sharing this. Lawrence, thank you for the work that you and Natalie and team do to bring us all together and have us talk about and think about these topics. And Louise, thanks for the beautiful introduction at the beginning. Wishing everyone a great day.
Well, I will thank everybody for making time to join us, and I echo your fantastic closing remarks there. Certainly buy the book and buy multiple copies and pass them on to people in your networks and on your boards. And a personal thanks at my end to Natalie Traceman, who really organised this whole event and made it happen. So special shout out and thanks to you, Nat, and please send in ideas for any other people you'd like us to showcase on this forum. We now have a large national and even some international attendees. As Peter Phillipson will recall, this whole idea started in a few boardrooms in Sydney, kindly hosted by some forward-thinking companies, and COVID kind of sent us another way and enabled us to do these large conversations on a national basis. But we've been remiss, I think, in not going back to in person, and I think it's time to do that. So if anyone has ideas or hosting options, please let us know, and willing to help and support. We also need event partners and sponsors just to kind of cover the costs, which are relatively low, and we're happy to do all the coordination. But I know you've got a full day ahead, so thank you to all of you for joining. I wish you all the best for the day, and a fantastic start to it. Thank you to all of you, Peter, Louise, and Kristen. So all the best.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks and bye.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Good fun.